In 1999, Cartoon Network made a decision that created a fascinating paradox. They acquired exclusive broadcast rights to the classic Warner Bros. Library, and quietly, they pulled Speedy Gonzales from the air.
Speedy Gonzales?
When pressed, their stated reason was that the character was an outdated ethnic stereotype, offensive to Mexicans. But the response they got defied their expectations entirely. The loudest, most organized protests against this ban came directly from Mexico and Mexican-American communities. So, how does a character deemed an offensive stereotype by American executives become fiercely defended by the very people it supposedly insulted? Let's find out. The evolution of a character's design actually reveals a lot about his true origins. In the summer of 1953, Robert McKimson, a Warner Bros. Director, developed a new animated short. The character's name was lifted straight from a raunchy joke a friend had told him. Now, the initial animation debuted in Cattails for Two and featured a pretty coarse prototype. Messy black hair, wide eyes, and a gold-capped tooth. The studio felt the look was just too rough, so layout artist Hawley Pratt was assigned to redesign him. By 1955, Pratt's version arrived, rounder, wearing white cotton, the traditional clothing of rural Mexican villages, paired with a yellow sombrero and red kerchief. This redesign starred in the standalone short simply titled Speedy Gonzales, which went on to win an Academy Award. The premise of that award-winning short was explicitly geographical. On screen, Sylvester the Cat guards an American cheese factory situated right on the U.S.-Mexico border. Just across the wire fence, a town of starving Mexican mice send for Speedy. He crosses the fence and he wins. The border was the premise from day one. The country knew exactly where it was set, even if the animators up in Burbank didn't quite grasp the full historical weight of what they were putting on screen. In 1953 and 1954, United States border policy operated through simultaneous contradictory mechanisms. On one side, you had the Bracero program. This was an official government system supplying agricultural labor to the American Southwest, recruiting over 201,000 Mexican nationals in 1953 alone. On the other side, running at the exact same time, was Operation Wetback, a massive deportation campaign that removed an estimated 1 million to 1.3 million people of Mexican descent, and that included American citizens. The border wasn't a closed wall. It was a highly regulated labor filter, calibrated to let bodies through when the labor was needed for the harvest and to expel them when they were not. The daily reality for these contracted workers was defined by intense physical exploitation. Braceros endured 12-hour shifts of stoop labor. They were frequently forced to use el cuartito, a short-handled hoe. This specific tool forced workers so close to the ground that a single season often left permanent damage to the back and shoulders. They were housed in segregated labor camps, which often consisted of converted barns, tents, and even chicken coops. And despite official contracts, their wages were routinely docked for tools, blankets, and food. Since their legal status was tied entirely to their employer, the constant threat of deportation was used by crew bosses to enforce compliance and absolute violence. These two policies actually merged into a system of ex post facto legalization. The government called it drying the wetbacks. Rather than returning undocumented farmhands to the interior of Mexico, the Border Patrol would simply escort them to the borderline, instruct them to symbolically step onto Mexican soil, and then immediately readmit them, handing them an official Bracero contract. Then, they were walked right back to the fields. U.S. growers were protected by the Texas Proviso of 1952, which exempted employers from legal penalty for hiring undocumented labor. The message sent by the border apparatus was precise. Your labor is wanted, but you are not. To fully understand this era, we have to look at the Falcon Dam. This was a joint project on the Rio Grande between Texas and Tamaulipas. On August 23, 1953, severe thunderstorms broke, and the reservoir began to fill rapidly. Residents on both sides of the border had to flee, leaving their possessions and flooded cemeteries behind. Exactly 6 days later, on August 29th, the cartoon Cattails for Two debuted in theaters, introducing Speedy Gonzales to the American public. And by October 19th, Presidents Eisenhower and Reese Cortines met on top of the dam to dedicate it, delivering speeches about friendship, while the waters continued to rise over streets that had existed since the colonial era. $4,000. This number represents the payout. The appraisers, many of whom were unfamiliar with generational land ownership, offered families $4,000 for homes that would cost $7,500 to rebuild elsewhere. Many residents on the border held Spanish land grants. Because the historical documents were labeled unclear by modern appraisers, numerous displaced families received nothing at all. Let's look at the reality of 1953. The physical destruction of Mexican heritage, the submersion of 250-year-old towns like Guerrero, and the displacement of generations occurred in the exact same month as the creation of a Burbank stereotype intended for mass consumption. The physical base of Mexican culture in the borderlands was being diminished by infrastructure and labor policies. Meanwhile, American media simultaneously filled that cultural void with a caricature defined by desperation and a comedic search for food. For a century, Hollywood assigned Mexican and Latino characters to a small, rigid set of fixed roles. The bandito, the harlot, the Latin lover, the dark lady, the female clown, and the male buffoon. Studios relied heavily on these stereotypes because they provided a cheap narrative economy. The buffoon or the bandito requires no complex introduction. An audience instantly recognizes the archetype before a single line of dialogue is spoken, during a simple image where actual characterization would take entire scenes to accomplish. Speedy belonged directly to the category of the male buffoon, a bumbling comic relief defined by broken English. But Speedy possessed an accidental structural inversion built right into his DNA. Because animated comedy requires a surviving protagonist to ensure there's a next episode, the Mexican mouse always won. Without exception, in every single short, the Anglo cat was defeated, the cheese factory was breached, and the starving mice ate. This inversion was just a structural convenience for the animators, certainly not a political manifesto, but it was undeniable on screen. So what happens when this crosses the border? When Mexican television networks like Canal 5 broadcast the cartoons, they didn't just translate the audio. As documented by historian Stephen J.C. Andes, they altered the character through dubbing. The English track relied on broken mock Spanish. That linguistic mockery was half the joke in Burbank. But the Spanish dubbing replaced it with standard Castilian spoken in a proud charral accent. The charral is the traditional horseman, a rural aristocrat, and a symbol of deep pride in Mexican culture. By stripping away the bad Spanish, the dubbing removed the insult. What was left was a fast, principled, undefeatable hero. Mexican audiences interpreted the character through their own cultural lens. Actor Eugenio Derbez articulated this perfectly, explaining how Mexicans saw Speedy as somewhat akin to Pancho Villa. Villa himself was a figure of contested representation, a hero to some, a bandito to others. Mexican culture had a long tradition of taking contested figures and claiming them on their own terms, deciding what they meant regardless of the labels assigned by outsiders. Speedy stepped effortlessly right into that existing interpretive tradition. This brings us back to our paradox. In 1999, Cartoon Network assumed American audiences needed protection from the caricature, pulling it from the air. By 2002, a spokeswoman finally confirmed the ban was due to ethnic stereotyping. What followed was a mass organization of fans across the internet, and formal demands for the character's return. The network was forced to restore the cartoons by June 2002, adding a disclaimer that the racial prejudices depicted were false. What the network ignored entirely was the 40 years of Mexican viewers who had already corrected the stereotype themselves, in their own language. The formal demand for his return was led by the League of United Latin American Citizens, the oldest Hispanic civil rights organization in the United States. Gabriela Lanes, their director of policy, delivered this statement. It perfectly illustrates the massive gap between the network's corporate intent and the community's lived reality. But communities starved for representation have looked at caricature, ignored the derogatory origins, and recognized a highly BASTA. This is Mexico.
If something here opened a door, stay and subscribe. BASTA is the second look. Mexico without the filter, without the shortcuts. New episodes every Tuesday and Saturday. See our suggested video right there in the box.